Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner, co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin. Welcome to our Public Affairs Forum. Our forums occur most Sundays at noon at our church. We're located at 4700 Grover Avenue, and we welcome you. If you want to find out more about our forums, please go to our church website at www.austinuu.org. And now one of our forum committee members, Peggy Morton, will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Bonnie. Well, we're in for a timely treat today, as our speaker is both an independent scholar and a public historian, Dr. Nancy Baker Jones, who will tell us about winning the vote, voting to win, women from suffrage to now. I hope everyone knows that it's Women's History Month here in March, and yesterday was the International Day of Women. You may have heard Nancy on KUT radio station as she and others are sharing Texas Women's History Month throughout this month daily. Nancy is the founding board member of the Ruth Weingarten Foundation for Texas Women in History, which has a website, womenintexashistory.org, which has a wealth of information to help students, the general public, everyone, because we need to get the word out about women. So I want to repeat that website, www.womenintexashistory.org. Nancy knew Ruth Weingarten well and co-authored a book with her entitled Capital Women, Texas Female Legislators from 1923 to 1999. She also directed research for the Handbook of Texas, co-edited the book, Women in Texas History, Selected Essays, and is currently editing a book series that will be devoted to Texas women's history to be published by the Texas A&M University Press. Using the example of women in Texas politics, her presentation today will touch on issues of democracy, equality, and the importance of women's history to all of us. With that, I'm honored to present to you Dr. Nancy Baker Jones.
Good morning. Thank you. That was a lovely introduction. It's so good to be here with you. My topic, as has already been mentioned, the title is Winning the Vote, Voting to Win, Political Women from Suffrage to Now. The first part of it has to do with winning the vote, which obviously had to be the suffrage movement. The second part, Voting to Win, has to do with women becoming voters and candidates. And then we'll talk about the overarching idea is political women from suffrage to now. All of these women have been political women, whether they're candidates or not. They understand politics and what it's taken in order to win the vote. I'm going to start way back before the Texas as we know it was Texas. I'm going to touch on Texas history, but I'm going to start with in the 17th and 18th century with the development of Enlightenment philosophy, without which we wouldn't be here today. Enlightenment philosophy, as you know, was an intellectual revolution in the world. It valued reason and science and logic over superstition, over magic, over belief. It valued democratic principles and self-government over the hierarchy of monarchy and papacy. And so one of the goals, really, of the Enlightenment philosophy was to get people to think differently about themselves in relation to where they lived and their government. And they wanted to really flatten hierarchies so that individual people were in charge of their own lives within their governments. Enlightenment philosophy also values self-government, obviously, and the best way for an individual to take part in government is to have a voice, and we have that voice by voting. So suffrage is a real key to self-government. As a result of Enlightenment philosophy, political revolutions formed, new democratic societies, and of course one of the most obvious was the United States, another one was France. These political revolutions then defined themselves through their documents, our Constitution, which said, this is how we want to operate, this is what our government, this is what our country is going to look like, this is what our democratic society is going to look like, and this is how it's going to operate. So the Constitutions define democratic values, and citizenship is one of the keys, because you have to be a citizen of a democracy in order to vote. In the beginning of this country, in 1776, when John Adams was debating the Declaration of Independence at the Second Continental Congress, everyone has heard about the comment that his wife Abigail made to him, "Remember the ladies." But there was more to that comment that we almost never hear. And I want to read it to you because I think it's remarkable. "Remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." So Abigail was more than just a gentle lady. She was a revolutionary herself. And she was warning John what could happen if he didn't remember the ladies. And of course, John rejected her request. And his comment to her was the despotism of the petticoat really worried him. And he preferred not to repeal our masculine systems. So it was very clear where John stood on the role of women and men in political life in the new United States. As a result, the Declaration of Independence does not mention women, and neither, in fact, did the Constitution. So women at that time had to ask themselves, women in particular here, I'm talking about well-educated white women, understood what was going on with the revolution. They were quite aware, as you can tell from Abigail's comment. And so they were then asking, well, if I cannot vote, then how am I supposed to be a citizen of this country? Which was a very good question. And the answer to that for a number of years was a concept called Republican motherhood. And what women were told was, you will be a citizen, you will be a good citizen, if you will educate your sons to become good citizens. And women said, well, okay. Then how am I going to become educated in order to do that? And what they did themselves was go out and start schools and start organizations so that they could then educate themselves to educate their sons, and they didn't leave their daughters out. They started educating their daughters as well. So what we have is a very early groundswell of women from the very beginnings of this country who were interested in citizenship, who wanted to know how they could be full citizens of the United States. And they were starting their own ways of educating themselves and each other. So the obvious questions that arise out of when people are talking about suffrage and citizenship is, are those two actually linked? Can you have suffrage without being a citizen? Can you be a citizen without being able to vote? And it was those kinds of questions because the irony of Enlightenment philosophy was, despite the overarching idea that democracy was important, what really happened was that gender, race, and economic inequality still existed. So that the first people who were able to vote in the United States were landed white men. Nobody who was black, nobody who was Native American, they weren't even considered, they were hardly considered human, much less citizens. So white women were not going to be voting. Only landed white men were going to vote. So the irritation about this was in existence from the early days. And what happened was social revolutions began to emerge. From the first political revolution, there are social revolutions that emerge because people are saying that's not right. All of us, in particular, need to be able to vote, to be citizens. And among those social revolutions which emerged in the early stages of the United States were the abolition movement to free slaves, to end slavery, and the women's suffrage movement. Now, one started earlier than the other. The abolition movement started in the 1830s, actually earlier, but there was always objection to slavery. But as an actual organized movement, it didn't start until the 1830s. And among those people who joined that were many women who also believed in suffrage. And out of that movement, the women's suffrage movement grew, because women felt that if they could vote, then they could help end abolition that much more quickly. But of course there was resistance. And there was a feeling that we can only do one thing at a time. And this is a feeling that continues, really, into the present, where social revolutions are concerned. People feel they have to make choices. So the abolition movement lasts from about the 1830s until after the Civil War. The U.S. women's suffrage movement really doesn't get started until 1848, when Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who was an abolitionist, holds the first women's rights convention. And what does she do? She uses the Declaration of Independence as a basis for writing the Declaration of Sentiments, in which she says that all men and women are created equal. And she demanded that 16 abuses and usurpations have compelled women to demand the equal station to which they are entitled. And this marks the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in 1848. And it doesn't end until when? When do we get the vote? 1920. Okay, so that's how 72 years it takes to win the vote. Now, what's going on in Texas at this time? Well, in Texas, there is a recapitulation, really, of what has happened in the United States. First of all, we have white slaveholding folks from the South moving into Texas as settlers individually, and then gradually a whole movement of colonization begins, and we have Stephen F. Austin and a lot of other people bringing colonists in, and they're bringing their slaves with them. And what they realize is that the Mexican government, which is where they live in Mexico, has outlawed slavery. And so the Texas settlers decide that that's not the way they want to live, and so we have a revolution. And the revolution in Texas is in large measure a revolution to preserve slavery for the white settlers who have moved in. After the revolution, we have our own country, our own republic. And when Texas becomes a republic, its constitution, which it develops, excludes African American and Native Americans from citizenship. It protects slavery, and it restricts suffrage to white males. We remain a republic until 1845, when Texas becomes a state, at which time we have a statehood constitution, which says the very same things as the Republic Constitution said. It protects slavery, it restricts suffrage to white males. Okay? Then Texas, almost immediately after statehood, gets involved in the war with Mexico, and after that comes the Civil War. So by the end of the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement in the United States has moved along quite a bit. In Texas, it hasn't even gotten started. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Texas is a big place. There was a level of education. Most of it was rural rather than cityfied. And there was a very strong bias against women voting in Texas, as much as there was a bias against abolition. All right. After the Civil War, we have some very important documents, very important amendments that are added to the Constitution, which again are making a statement about the state of our commitment to democracy. But the 13th Amendment is passed in 1865, which abolishes slavery. The 14th Amendment is passed in 1868. It defines citizens as people born or naturalized in the U.S., but it protects the right to vote of adult males only. So, therefore, it discriminated explicitly on the basis of sex. And in 1868, that was the first year that somebody petitioned the Texas legislature for women's suffrage. So that's when that started. But, of course, it didn't go anywhere. This petition didn't go anywhere because the general feeling was that voting for women was unwomanly and it would unsex them. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and that declared that citizens could not be prevented from voting because of their race, color, or previous condition of servitude, but it doesn't mention sex. So, in essence, the 15th Amendment gives the right to vote to African Americans. And whether they're actually able to vote is another question. But constitutionally, they are able to vote, but it doesn't mention sex. So once again, women have been ignored in terms of their ability to vote in the United States. So in Texas, what's happening is that in 1868, we've had this first attempt. to bring suffrage to the forefront in the legislature. And there are 5 more times between 1868 and 1917 when there are attempts made to win suffrage for women. And each time they fail. Those attempts fail. In 1875, there's a new constitution for Texas, and Article 6 of the new constitution defines who may not vote, including minors, lunatics, paupers, and felons, and it doesn't even mention women. Okay? So just because these repeated attempts in the legislature failed doesn't mean that women weren't trying to organize. And through all of those years, from really 1868 until 1917 and 18, women are organizing throughout the state, and men who support suffrage are organizing throughout the state. And eventually there are black women's suffrage organizations as well. But there always was, and there remained, a problem with racism in the women's suffrage movement that happened in Texas as well as nationally. And so African American women are forming their own organizations to work for themselves. So it's really quite surprising, actually, that we finally win the vote in 1918 in Texas, and it's only for voting in primaries. And the story about how that happened is pretty interesting, in that Governor Hobby was hesitating to move for suffrage, and by that time there was a woman named Minnie Fisher Cunningham who was really in charge of most of the suffrage activities in the state. And she decided to make a deal with somebody in the legislature, and it turned out to be a man named Charles Metcalf, who was from San Angelo. She said that if you will get a bill before the legislature and you will support primary suffrage, I will get women out and I will get them to vote for Hobby for governor in the primary. And so he says, okay. And he says, now I want you to back off. I'm going to take care of all of this, little lady, because I don't want a masterful, quote-unquote, masterful woman like you upsetting any of the guys in the legislature. Okay? You will offend them, so I'll take care of this. So he does. He keeps his end of the bargain. And he lines up the votes. He introduces a primary suffrage bill. It passes both chambers, and it gets Hobby's signature because Hobby's signing it because he knows he's got something to get from it. Okay. So what happened was that Cunningham and her people got 386,000 people, women, to register to vote in 17 days between when the bill was passed and when the primary election was held. They do it, and they get Hobby elected. Now, there's another attempt after that to get a state suffrage amendment passed. At the time, the suffragists were trying 2 ways to get suffrage passed. Some of them were working on the state level, going from legislature to legislature. Some of them were working on the national level, trying to get a constitutional amendment. So at the state level in Texas, there was an attempt to get a state suffrage amendment passed, but it failed. So we in Texas had to wait until June in 1920, when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution, that was 1919, when the 19th Amendment to the Constitution was submitted to the states for ratification. And in 1920, the states that were necessary to ratify it finally finished that process, and so it became a part of the Constitution. So it only took 72 years in the United States. It only took 52 years in Texas for women to win the vote. And despite that victory, however, full voting rights for African Americans, Tejanos, and Tejanas was denied and delayed, really until the Civil Rights Acts of the 1960s. So that's a real quick run-through of how we got to win suffrage. Then what happened immediately was that women started running for office immediately. And on that cold January day in 1923, when a Dallas attorney named Edith Wilmans walked through the doors of the legislature as the first woman elected to the legislature, she was a lawyer from Dallas, the world really changed. Because before she got there, women in the legislature had really been considered mostly support staff, if they existed at all. They were social companions, they were call girls, they were wives, but they weren't taken seriously as lawmakers. The truth is that along with barrooms and bordellos. The legislature has been the most male-dominated institution in Texas history. It's really a men's room where attitudes about women have been really slow to change. And since 1923, women have been a numerical minority there. You can see from the handout that was passed around, you can see how many women were in the legislature in every session since 1923. There are long streaks where there were no women. There were long periods where there was maybe only one woman or two women. So the reality is that women have always been a numerical minority there, and the reality of this is played out in three important ways. First, they face a double standard that men don't. Second, this double standard forces them to make a conscious decision about how they're going to behave. And third, the double standard affects the issues that they decide to support. And this double standard is pretty simple. Men generally lump female lawmakers into two categories. They were either not very ladylike, because for whatever reason they lumped them together with the women that they were familiar with seeing around the legislature, and so they either treated them as not very ladylike, or if they reminded them, say, of their aunts or their wives or their daughters, they didn't take them very seriously, because really the culture said women don't belong here. This is politics is a man's business. Women belong in the home. So that was the double standard. They were either treated as not very ladylike, or they weren't taken seriously at all if they were ladies. As late as this attitude actually still exists in the legislature. As late as the 1980s, Libby Linebarger, who was a member of the House from Manchaca, said she really looked forward to the time when she would not be called little lady, sugar, or darling. This leads to my second point, that the double standard requires women to make a conscious decision about how they're going to behave, because they know they're going to be treated in a certain way. Barbara Jordan made a decision to be one of the boys. On her first day in the Senate, in 1967, a colleague apologized to her for using the term son of a bitch. And her reply was, "Listen, Senator, if you say he's a son of a bitch, he's a son of a bitch." And she said in an interview with us, that took care of their deferring their language to me. They didn't need to worry about that I was just this little delicate flower. Now, Sissy Farenthold took a very different path in 1971. She led efforts to reveal which House members were involved in the Sharpstown bank fraud scandal. And she led a statewide movement for political reform. And although she got widespread public support, she was the object of a lot of political retribution while she was still in the legislature. Almost none of her legislation passed during her second session, and the Speaker of the House, Gus Mutcher, threatened to make public some photographs that he had taken of her son, who was then an anti-war activist. And Sissy ran for governor twice, but she never made it to the ticket. She lost both of those attempts, and she finally left politics altogether. I will say that I saw her just this week, and she looks wonderful. She's still at it. She's still traveling the world for peace and justice. This brings me to my third point, that the double standard affects the issues women decide to support. So here we have to face an important strategic reality, and that is that since there have never been enough women in the legislature that they could just by themselves pass legislation. That means they had to strategically make alliances with people who may not have agreed with them, certainly with men. And they had to look for ways of educating people. They had to develop really creative ways of educating people. So women have always had to build coalitions with men. But they've had to decide also what kind of issues they were going to support. For some of them, the term women's issues, as it used to be considered, meant things having to do with women and family and child care and health and social reform. It was also kind of a dirty word in the legislature, because there were a lot of the guys who thought that women were radical if they supported these things, and it was going to upset the natural balance of gender, in which men were considered to be superior to women. So women have had to, as long as they've been there, decide the degree to which they're going to present themselves as feminists or just not. And there have actually been some women who have declined to carry legislation that would benefit women and children because of that very reason. They didn't want to be labeled as a feminist or a woman's liber. The term women's issues eventually became redefined as people's issues in the 1980s, which is a great thing because all of those issues are really everybody's issues. It has been the case that it has actually been the case that a bill of special interest to women has had a better chance of passing if a more conservative person carried it than a self-described feminist. And that's exactly what happened to Minnie Fisher Cunningham when the representative from St. Angelo said, "Let me handle it." And he got it passed. And at some level, women have had to say, fine, what I want to do is see something get passed, so I can't have my ego involved in all of this. The irony is that although the dynamic has changed, women, whether progressive or conservative, are still the legislators most likely to support such issues. And research indicates that this is likely to be true until women members reach 50% or more of any legislature. So you can look at that chart again and you can see how long we have to go before women are 50% of the legislature. We're only at 20% nationally right now and in Texas. And the first time we reached that benchmark was in 2009. So it took 86 years from 1923 to 2009 to reach 20%. If it takes that much longer to double that percentage even, most of us won't be alive. So that's a sobering thought. Think about the significance of women in politics. Male-dominated legislatures usually don't act with the interests of their female constituents in mind. So the fact that there are women in legislatures is very important if some of these issues are important to us. So if men are not representing women adequately, and women appear to represent women's concerns better than men do, human issues really, then we have concluded per se that women do make a difference. So it's essential that women be here in the legislature. Let me give you just a rundown of some of the things that women have accomplished. During the 1920s, there were 4 women who served, and they supported the issues of the Women's Joint Legislative Council, which was at the time the most effective lobbying group in the state in Texas history. And so they were able to pass such things as mother-infant health care, education surveys, public schools, a state board of education, state oversight of day nurseries, children's homes, and adoption agencies. We're not able to strengthen anti-child labor laws. In the 1930s, there was a proposal to legalize jury service for women, but that didn't pass. In the 1940s and 50s, it was a somewhat difficult period for women because of the Red Scare, political corruption, anti-labor laws, and segregation. But a woman named Ray Still tried to pass child support laws to help single mothers, but couldn't get enough support. Women did finally win the right to serve on juries in... Anybody know the year when we got the right to serve on juries? 1954. In the 1960s and 70s, with the rise of the Civil Rights Act and women's movements, we saw passage of Marital Property Act, equal credit laws, and we can thank Sarah Weddington and Kay Bailey for that. Reform of sexual assault laws, also the two of them worked across the aisle for those. Job protection for pregnant teachers, the creation of a Fair Housing Commission, the addition of family planning services, access to kindergarten for 5-year-olds, and a state equal legal rights amendment for the first time ever. Texas was the first southern state to ratify the federal ERA, and we have a state equal rights amendment, believe it or not. In the 1980s and 90s, women obtained financial support for displaced homemakers, increased protection against child and spousal abuse, got a Bill of Rights for the ill elderly, immunization for poor children, reform of educational finance, and alimony for spouses with no other means of support. That particular bill was the work of Synfronia Thompson, who is still there. While Ann Richards was governor, the legislature had the most women ever, and they helped pass legislation to fund mental health care reform, expand the rights of crime victims, make stalking a criminal offense, eliminate spousal immunity in sexual assault, and enhance punishment for family violence. So, back to my earliest comments, women's winning the vote and becoming elected officials are 2 examples of the huge social reform that were in keeping with Enlightenment values. Achieving this was the equivalent of the revolution that Abigail Adams vowed to foment back in 1776. And we are all beneficiaries of the fact that there were women in our past who not only took federal and state constitutions seriously, but worked to make sure that they included women. And I'm afraid we all take that for granted now. I'm actually concerned that a significant change is underway in our political culture. This consists of a gradual deterioration of consensus that federal and state governments have a role to play in forming a more perfect union and establishing justice and promoting the general welfare. For one example, public statements that government is the enemy of the people and movements calling for limited government and for secession have become surprisingly common. What does this have to do with women? Well, it has a lot to do with women. Since the 1990s, growth of faith-based services and charter schools has resulted in shifting state funds to private groups, which is blurring the lines between church and state. And this has been accompanied by the largest tax cuts in Texas history, which happened in the late 1990s and contributed to a $27 billion budget deficit by 2011. Cutting $5.5 billion from public education alone, costing thousands of teachers their jobs and making Texas 48th of 50 states in per-student funding. With each legislative session since 1999, new restrictions have been placed on women's reproductive health services and facilities that provide them. We saw just this week that 2 more facilities were closed because of legislation that came out of the 83rd legislature. The 82nd legislature required transvaginal sonograms and cut $73.5 million from the health department's family planning programs. By January of 2012, 147,000 women were going without annual exams, birth control, and wellness checkups, to say nothing of abortions. This is general wellness and birth control that's going by the wayside. Now, Texas has the second highest birth rate in the nation, and more than half of those babies are born to women on Medicaid. The Legislative Budget Board has recently estimated that losing access to contraception would lead to over 24,000 pregnancies, and we're already seeing that happen. They're being born right now. In addition, the state rejected over $30 million in federal funds for the Medicaid Women's Health Program. And although the state is paying for some of that bill, it has eliminated Planned Parenthood clinics, even those that do not provide abortions, from participating. So we're seeing clinics closing and confusing among patients where services can be received, leading obviously to more and more unintended pregnancies in the poorest of our population. Women who are wealthy don't have that problem. They can go wherever they need to get the health care they need. It's the women who can't afford it who are suffering. So in closing on this particular point, I want to reiterate a point I made a bit ago, that male-dominated legislatures don't usually act with the interests of their female constituents in mind. They need to be reminded. I'm hoping that's changing. There are a lot of men who are feminists, and they understand it without being told. It hasn't always been the case. So women do make a difference. It's essential that we have women in the legislature. And that brings us to today, which is pretty exciting because we have 2 women at the top of the ticket for governor and lieutenant governor. That's never happened in the state before. It's amazing. It tells me that the public can be galvanized through issues that are important to everybody, that aren't just involving gas and oil or land or whatever. These are issues. These are human issues, and so I'm very hopeful that Texas is going to do what's right. You know, we'll see what happens, but I think every one of us who is interested in seeing 2 women in the Capitol, and the governor and the lieutenant governor, are going to have to work pretty hard to make that happen. The last thing I want to do is just point out again this chart that I handed out, which shows you how it gives you a sense from the earliest days to the present, the percentage of women who were there, who were in the legislature, and in each of the House and the Senate, the totals, and then on the back it shows you where Texas stands in relation to the rest of the country. So I'll close my comments and see if you have any questions.
Thank you. Okay, Glenn Williams.
Yes, I'd like to ask a little bit more about the 1918 passage of the bills. Was there still significant opposition? If so, who was opposed? And basically, how did this representative from San Angelo get through both the House and Senate with what I assume is still fairly controversial?
Right, and I don't have all the details about that, but I think what happened really was that there was a momentum that grew up over all of the decades and decades.
To the point where there were at least enough people to pass it who felt that that was the right thing to do. And that's what education does. And maybe he was married to a suffragist. You know? Yeah. Oh, I think you've got the microphone.
We have a question here from John Franks.
Yeah, I have a question about the legislature and the fact that women seem to be used, like Senator Jane Nelson, to put a feminine face on some of the regressive laws that are put forward.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can ignore the fact that there are conservative women who hold their beliefs very dearly and who are, I consider myself a feminist, and there are women who would not like to have that term applied to them. I think it's going to be very, very interesting. In fact, one of the legislatures, if it wasn't the 82nd, it was the one before that, had the most conservative Republicans in it ever, and it was like 75% to 25%. So I think what I'm saying is that the role of conservative women is going to be very interesting to watch, to see to what extent they have an influence over progressive legislation, and the kinds of challenges that people who want progressive legislation, how they're going to have to build coalitions in order to get that happen. We see it happen in the Congress all the time. Okay.
We have a question here. Would you say your name, please?
Alice Harris. On the same subject that was just mentioned, last summer there were conservative women who actually fought against certain programs that were beneficial to women. Mm-hmm. What is your opinion?
Well, they're going to do that. I mean, I think it's high time that we recognize that not all women are alike in the way they think. And there are lots of women who are very conservative. What I think is interesting, though, is that there are also some conservative women who, behind the scenes, are saying, we really need to have birth control, you know. So that's why I say I think it's going to be interesting. I don't know the answer to that.
We have a question from Peter Durkin.
In your research, is there any place where there is a quota system where legislatures are mandated to have 50-50?
Not in this country, but there are in other countries.
And what is that experience like?
Well, what that means is you get a 50-50 split. But you have to find, I mean, if that's the law, then you have to find the candidates. And it's a very new concept. And so I don't think there's a lot of research about that. It's an interesting concept, and democracies are going to have to think about.
You know, what does that mean? What's more important, just having anybody who wants to run, or is it so important to our democracy that we have to have women?
A higher percentage of women. I don't see the United States getting to that point for a long time. Yeah, especially Texas. Yeah.
We have a question from Richard Halpin.
Thank you, Bonnie Gardner, and First Unitarian Universalist Church for this terrific forum. And thank you for being with us today. Would you talk a little bit more about this dynamic that happens at the Texas legislature where women seem to be treated differently than men? They seem to be treated in a way that puts them in jeopardy, actually, by the policies that our lawmakers make. And I don't quite understand how the consciousness of people works that would make decisions that would put part of the population at risk based on their gender. I'm baffled somehow. Would you try to talk to that?
You know, that's a question that has baffled people for centuries. So it's a very good question. My own sense is that in the legislature in particular, this has grown out of a long, long, long history of gender inequality in this country and actually in every civilization around the world for as long as there have been men and women. There has been a distinction made between what women do and what men do, and along with that comes an evaluation of how important that work is. And for some reason, the value of what men do has been considered more socially important than the value of what women do. And women have been consigned primarily to domestic work, to raising children. It probably comes from a long, long, long ancient history of women being the people who were supposed to bear and raise and nurture the children, and the men were supposed to go out and protect the clan or the tribe, whatever. In the legislature, I think, we had a lot of gender arguments during the suffrage movement where it truly was considered for many people, and some people back this up with their religious beliefs, that the proper role of a woman was subservient to her husband or to men, and because God was the father, that role was assumed by the male in the family, and the woman was subservient to the male, and any woman who left that paradigm was accused of being a bad person. So the appearance of when the world is bifurcated and people say, well, men belong over here and women belong over here, or they say blacks belong over here and whites belong over here, or Indians belong over here and whites belong over here, that kind of thing. What happens is there's very little the reasoning behind that usually has to do with some sort of notion of superiority and inferiority. And when those people start getting out of those getting into formerly forbidden areas, when women enter the legislature, they are regarded as problems. They are going against nature. They're going against God. They are no longer feminine. They are really trying to be men. All of those kinds of things were arguments about why women should not vote. And it was an easy world in which people, men went out and took care of politics and women took care of the home. That all seemed to be crumbling, and so it seems to me that there's a lot of fear in some people that the world that they are comfortable with and understand and which privileges them is falling apart. And so they blame those who they say are causing it. Yeah.
We have a question from Douglas Bauer.
First, Dr. Jones, I want to thank you for an excellent presentation. My question has to do with, first I'll preface it by saying that I see a lot of attacks from the current conservative state government on women's rights. And yet at the same time, Texas has one of the lowest percentages of women that vote in the country of any state. So my questions are, why do you think that is, and what do we do about it?
That's a really good question, too. It's true. We have one of the lowest voting rates among women in the United States. Part of that has to do with the psychology of being someone who is always cast in an inferior role. And part of it has to do with, I'm still trying to figure out why there are people who vote against their own interests. I think that's a real serious question about what's going on now. Why in the world would there be any women or men who love women who want to take health care away from women? I don't understand it, except that someone who is fomenting these kinds of laws feels that that benefits society in some way. And I think I'm not a psychiatrist, but I have to go back to very basic kinds of things about how people construct their own identity and what's important to them to be considered superior or important or powerful. And when something that they perceive to be less than that makes the world change, they become afraid and scared, and so they want to put things back the way they think they ought to be. And when they get in the power to do it, they'll do it.
We have a question from Leslie Kearns.
Hi, my question, you may have already addressed some of this, but I wonder why you see that women's issues, it seems, become political footballs quite easily, and particularly the abortion issue, but now it seems a much wider range of women's issues are such political red meat, for example.
I think it goes back to what we've just been talking about. I think there are, for some people, there's a real fear that women are going to somehow take control, somehow take authority away, get out of their natural places. It's kind of a mystery to me, but some of it I do believe is biblically based, and that there are among some folks for whom the Bible is fact, that science and logic are less persuasive than the emotion of religious fervor. That's some of it. That's not all of it.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name?
I'm Stuart Snyder. I'm co-president of the League of Women Voters of the Austin area.
Right.
So I have a question about what lessons can we take from the suffragists who spent 70 years fighting to get the vote. What lessons can we take from that and apply to today when Texas is such a low voter turnout state? I know you already addressed low voter turnout,
Sure.
but I think there's something from the early 20th century that we could use today.
I think what the suffragists did that finally got them to succeed was education and organization. And they mobilized people who supported what they supported. And they got their friends and they talked to them and they convinced them to change their minds if they needed to. And so the movement grew. And more people understood it to be not something that was terrifying, but something that was natural. That if you were going to be a citizen of the United States, then you needed to be able to vote. It's true now. My husband and I have a friend who's never voted. She finally voted for the first time in the primary. That's one person, but that's a real victory. So if each of us could find some people who have never voted or who just don't vote and try to talk to that person and find out why they don't vote, maybe we could incrementally, one person at a time, see that change.
We have a question from our former forum chair for 25 years, Chris Cunningham.
Thank you. I'm sorry that this is not a very deep, piercing question. It's simply, what time during the week does the Texas Women's History Moment come on KUT?
They are on 4 times a day, and there are different times, but it's always 4 minutes after the hour. Like this morning, it was on at 8 o'clock, 8:04. I have the schedule if you want me to email it to somebody. Or you can go to KUT.org, and I think the schedule is there. That would be easier. Yeah, thank you for asking. Also, I have been asked by Fox News, the local Fox channel, to come on every Wednesday morning at 7:45 and talk about a woman in Texas history. So Wednesday mornings this month, I'll be doing that at 7:45.
Great.
Yeah.
Fox News, no less.
Yes, I know. I'm sorry.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name, please?
My name is Margaret Wood, and I would like to know how we can get better sex education in the public schools. The parents say they want to have it in the home, and we don't do it. I mean, I want kids to know how much it costs. I don't care what kind of condoms they're talking about. I want them to know how much it costs, how much trouble they are. We just need to do a little bit better job.
I agree with you wholeheartedly, and I wish I knew the answer to that. Sex education is one of those things that some parents just don't want to talk about. My parents never did. So it runs pretty deep. I think that's why the schools have been doing it, because there are a lot of parents who just don't want to do it. I'm afraid I don't have a good answer. If everybody who is a parent could say to their children, could talk to them about it, that would help.
I love it that we're getting questions from new people and people who don't ordinarily ask questions. Would you say your name, please?
Hi, I'm Lisa LeBlanc, and I was down at the legislature this summer, and I was shocked at the cruelty that I witnessed that was directed at women.
By whom?
Legislators, not willing to discuss any points of any, make any compromises whatsoever. And where does this cruelty come from? I mean, honestly, it was, to me, it's a human rights issue.
Yeah.
And I was quite shocked. I've never been involved politically, and what I saw was disturbing. The attack that they're doing to women and the cruelty, and women are going to die.
Oh, they already are.
I mean, that's what's happening, and they would not even discuss it.
I didn't talk about the birth control movement, but it took a long time for birth control to be legalized. And that's a very basic thing, that a lot of people just wanted to see women stay pregnant and stay at home so that they could be more easily controlled. Their lives could be more easily controlled. I am absolutely flummoxed by the reemergence of some of those attitudes, but that's what's happening. There is a very basic, sort of primitive desire to see women sit down and shut up, go home and have babies. And I think it's a very critical time in our history to resist that. So I have seen the kind of cruelty that you are talking about. I don't understand it, except as a result of fear. Fear of women who, there's this it's ancient belief that, who was it, Maxine Hong Kingston, who said that the Chinese believed that women were so powerful they had to have their feet bound to stop them. There is this very primitive fear of something about women's power or energy or something that a lot of people are afraid of, and that includes some women who buy into this notion. It's not just men. That goes deeper than anything that I can explain.
I'm going to ask a question. It's a rather open-ended one. I can remember in the 70s there was a very strong women's movement across the country and even in Texas, and that's kind of subsided. And now I sense actual fear on the part of women and fear of reprisal. And so the women's movement has become diluted, and many people are not speaking out as freely as they did 30 years ago. And to me, that's really shocking and disappointing. What do you think are some of the factors in this kind of reversal, and what can we do about it?
Well, we see the same thing since President Obama was elected, of people saying we're now in a post-racial society, that we don't have racism anymore because we were able to elect an African-American president. Well, that's crazy. Racism is alive and well, and so is sexism, and so is, spousal abuse, and all those kinds of things are alive and well. So the basic question is, again, why do people act against their own interests? The women's movement, I think, it takes a certain amount of time and energy and purpose to get a movement going. And sometimes people just get exhausted and they drop out and they have to take care of their families or whatever. And so I think there was a time when the women's movement thought that everything was accomplished. Now, we never got the Equal Rights Amendment. We still don't have that in the Constitution. And so women really are still not mentioned in the Constitution. So I think all of these they all come in waves. There was, after the suffrage movement, after suffrage was won, then there was immediately, Alice Paul decided we needed an Equal Rights Amendment. That started in 1920. That was how the League of Women Voters started, was when suffrage was accomplished. But then people think, okay, we've won, now we're done with that. Check that off. And they go back to their own lives. So this is a natural kind of an ebb and flow in terms of movements. I feel now that we've been in so many decades since the mid-90s of this growing, very, very conservative kind of anti-humanitarian notions that are spreading politically, that I think as Americans we're sort of slow to boil, and we're not really a revolutionary people despite the way we began. So I think it takes a lot to light a flame. I think the civil rights movement was one of those flames that burst on the scene. The second women's movement in the 1970s, as you mentioned, reignited after the first women's movement had stopped. And I'm hoping that we're going to see another one build.
Yes, and I sometimes worry because I do think there have been significant advances, and some younger women are not aware of how recent these advances are and may take them for granted. But we have a very fragile hold on our current place in society.
Yeah, that's true. And so sometimes what it takes is for the younger generation to wake up and say, whoa, wait a minute, I thought that was solved, but it's not. And I'm about to lose everything. Yeah.
So now what should we do, I think? That's my question. I mean, how can we start the fire? Because I think that's what we need to do. I mean, I feel like the fire has started because of Wendy and Letitia and because of things that happened at the legislature.
You know, that started because Wendy Davis and Letitia Vanderbilt decided, I'm not going to put up with this anymore. This is crap. And I'm going to say something about it. And they did, and they realized that there were thousands and thousands of people in the state who agreed with them. And I think a lot of us feel like we're alone, sitting, worrying about things over the breakfast table. I think if we could be forthright in our feelings with our friends and our communities, this wonderful community that you have here, I think that a lot can be sparked by people mobilizing and organizing and educating each other, and being passionate about what they feel and taking some risks. You know, send some money to some campaigns or decide you're going to go door to door. Talk to people you wouldn't ordinarily talk to who don't understand why you would support, you know, so-and-so. And tell them why. And tell them about I have fears for my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. You know, what kind of a society are they going to inherit? Is it still going to be democratic? Is it still going to be humane? Are women still going to be able to vote? I mean, if they can take away birth control, they can take away the vote, you know. So I try not to get too paranoid, but I also try to keep sort of a feeling of reality attached to what I'm seeing, you know.
Also, thank you for reminding us of all the work that we need to do in the days and years ahead. Let's give her a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you.